Okay, so welcome back to the second half of our lecture on the capabilities approach to justice. Last time we talked about some of the criticisms of utilitarianism and the social contract approach, and we introduced some of the basics of capabilities theory, even though that's not exactly the way that Nussbaum works it out. So this time we're going to go on and we're going to look more specifically at what Martha Nussbaum thinks about the capabilities approach to social justice. So usually at this point I might put a picture of the person that we're talking about, and then I would suggest things about them and whatever else. And I suppose I could say that Martha Nussbaum is a professor at the University of Chicago, and that she's a philosophical badass and one of the most important philosophers working today, who actually reaches out to the public and is a public intellectual in many ways, and all sorts of stuff I could say about her. But I actually want to let her say some stuff at this point, because she does a fairly good job of it, and we're to a point where we actually have a video that's fairly accessible from one of the people that we're talking about. So what I want you to do right now is to go over and click on that video right there, and when you do it, it'll pop up another video that's the video of her talking. And this is from a documentary called The Examined Life that they made with philosophers, where they made them walk around and talk about their philosophy. I don't know why they did that, but in any case, it's a fairly good documentary in general, but also the part on Martha Nussbaum covers some of the critiques that we've talked about and some of her own theory. So go. Oh, and if that doesn't work, I'll put it down in the description down beneath. You'll be able to get there and click on it. And if you do that, then you'll have to pause the screen where I am. Okay, you go. I'll wait for you. And actually, if you paused it, that I didn't need to wait. Could just instantly go on. So, in case you were wondering, yes, the stuff from that video will be on the test as much as the stuff from this video, because, it's just all count the same. All right, so let's go into a little bit more of Nussbaum's approach. So Nussbaum identifies as a kind of neo-Aristotelian, and she does this throughout her philosophy, which addresses like the place of the emotions in the human life and luck in relation to the good, and she draws a whole lot from Aristotle. But she also appreciates some of the goods that have been pointed out by the liberal tradition over time. And so you can find her saying things like, my kind of Aristotle is a very Rawlsian Aristotle, which is interesting because the two of them are not exactly peas in a pod. Aristotle started with an account of the good human life, whereas Rawls starts with an account of a procedure in order to allow us to think about justice, and thinks that people should strip off everything but their basic human rationality in order to think about justice. And Rawls, being in the liberal tradition, thinks primarily in terms of individual rights and the individual before the state or community, whereas Aristotle, of course, thought about human beings as political animals and imagined that people are first morally distinguished not in terms of their rights, but in terms of their duties. But Nussbaum wants to bring together these two different traditions and suggests that she can do so in part by bringing Aristotle closer to Rawls, because she's going to say that human nature and the full human life depends upon modes of liberty and freedom. So whereas Aristotle said, well, you know what, in order to live the good and full human life, it doesn't concern us what you want to do with your life, it concerns us where you best function. And so we can in fact plug you into that place in society. But Nussbaum wants to say that making your own choices about your life is itself a good that's fundamental to human life. So you can't have the kind of society that Aristotle wanted, although this is argued on Aristotelian grounds. She doesn't think that Aristotle's procedure in this was entirely wrong. She just thinks that he missed a fundamental good that's a part of the fulfilled human life. And she wants to bring Rawls a little bit closer to Aristotle in that she's going to articulate then something about this fulfilled human life, but she doesn't want to come up with a finished or absolutely complete picture of human life because she wants to allow for that freedom, for those rights, because people need to have liberty in order to live fully human. So they're going to have rights. So in many ways, Nussbaum is where the classical thought and the contemporary liberal thought come together, and she tries to mesh them together in some kind of way. So let's say some things specific about how she does this. Well, number one is she wants to start her own approach with an account of human dignity. And this is important because instead of starting out her account with a particular process or human rationality or a state of nature or anything like that, she believes that we need to start by recognizing the dignity of all human beings simply on the basis of their being human beings. It is on the basis of their very nature that we recognize that they are beings of moral worth, and they don't have to have particular rational capabilities or particular powers or anything like that in order to count morally. So we can see here her pushing against that social contract tradition, at least when it became rationalist and when it was focused on particular powers you needed in order to be participant in the social contract. In some ways, she overlaps with utilitarianism in that utilitarianism did want to pay attention to a broader range of people, but unlike that, her idea is about dignity, not about happiness. So again, it's not even their ability to experience pleasure or pain that makes them important. Even if a human being didn't have that, they would still have some level of dignity on Nussbaum's account. But we fill out what that dignity looks like with an account of the human person. In the last lecture, I mentioned that capabilities theorists start out with accounts of human functioning. Now, Nussbaum's theory does depend upon an account of human functioning. All of her capabilities are pointed at particular human functions. But Nussbaum doesn't emphasize human functioning. Instead, she emphasizes the capabilities. And the reason behind this is her affinity for the liberal tradition. Focusing on human functions might lead to the conclusion that a society is supposed to get people to their own full human functioning. But Nussbaum actually wants to leave that open to the individual. Justice, as she imagines it, only requires that people are provided with the means goods necessary to achieve threshold levels of their capacities to achieve human fulfillment. Then what elements of their own human fulfillment they want to actualize remains up to the individuals. So again, both Aristotelian and liberal. Now, beyond this, Nussbaum recognizes that not all human capabilities are core human capabilities. That is to say, not all human capabilities are capabilities that we need to have in order to have a fulfilling life. For instance, I started off the last lecture by talking about a set of capabilities that I do not have. Capability to do yo-yoing incredibly well, or to do the paddle thing. Well, those are not core human capabilities. Woohoo! I don't need those in order to have a fulfilled human life. And there's a whole set of these. For instance, some human abilities have capabilities to do contortionism. And like people who go on, America's Got Talent, they have unique capabilities. Some people don't just have the capability to listen to music, but to be opera stars. And it's not the case that everybody needs all of those capabilities. The capability to be an opera star or to be a contortionist in order to have a fulfilling life. What Nussbaum's interested in then, especially when she gets down to her account of justice, has to do with core human capabilities. those capabilities that line up with functions that are really necessary in order to have a baseline fulfilled human life. And she, unlike Amartya Sen, is actually going to give us a list of these. So we don't just have to have the idea of core human capabilities. She's going to give us an account of what she thinks core human capabilities are. Okay, so Nussbaum, like Nozick, wants to be able to talk about what people are entitled to. But she's got a very different approach to entitlement than Nozick does. You remember that Nozick says we're entitled to things if we have acquired them justly and exchanged them justly. But Nussbaum has a more robust account where she wants to recognize positive rights for people depending upon how they start out and what they need in order to achieve full human lives. So this is my formulation, but I take it to be what Nussbaum is getting at. That people are entitled to the means goods necessary to achieve threshold levels of central human capabilities. Now, I'm going to say more about threshold here in a minute, but the basic idea is that people have a right to basic means goods necessary to allow them to participate in a full human life. So they have a right to a certain amount of food and to accessibility in particular ways and to education and to negative rights as well, things like liberty, that other people are supposed to stay out of their way in terms of their freedom of speech. So Nussbaum ends up producing an account of rights out of this Aristotelian tradition. Again, here's Aristotle, liberal tradition, they're kissing down here. Woo! So to what exactly are you entitled if you need to be able to have a particular capacity? Well, Nussbaum again qualifies here because it's not the case that you are entitled to all of the means goods necessary to maximize your capacities, even your core human capacities. So, for instance, even if I ought to have the capability, say, to listen to music, this doesn't mean that I need to have all of the means goods to listen to every type of music that I might want to listen to. Even if I ought to have the capacity to, say, be mobile, this doesn't mean that I need to have the capacity to run a marathon. Nussbaum believes that there's a kind of base level that we need in order to have a dignified life. That doesn't require that we maximize our capabilities, but it does require that we're able to have those capabilities. This is what she talks about when she talks about a threshold level. We are entitled to the means goods, allowing our capabilities to that threshold level. Beyond that, we are not entitled to those goods. Now, we could certainly argue about where the threshold level is. So, for instance, we've suggested that participation in politics might be a capability that we're concerned with, and we've suggested that education is a means good to adequately participate in politics. But what's the threshold level that we should have? Should we have, as a matter of fact, that elementary school is the threshold level necessary in order to allow people to have sufficient capacity in that area? Or do we want to go higher than that? Do we say high school? Or do we want to say college at this point really is, in fact, a required means good to participate adequately? Well, we can argue about where these thresholds are. And as it turns out, that's a fairly big area for argument because we can argue about exactly what people should have access to, which means goods are necessary to give them a threshold level of their capacities. So while Nussbaum talks about being entitled to things, having certain positive rights to means goods, there's still a lot of argument to detail exactly what that looks like. Unlike Amartya Sen, Nussbaum actually gives us a list of human capabilities that she thinks that people ought to be able to have. These are her capabilities that she thinks that people ought to be able to actualize in order to have a fulfilling human life. And so as we go through, you can also argue about this. Do you think she's picked out the right ones? Or do you think that there are other ones that should have been added in? So the first central human capability is fairly basic and actually overlaps with the Lockean tradition. It's life. And so what are the means goods that people might be entitled to in order to have the capability to realize and continue life? Well, we can imagine some of these means goods will be the ability to be born safely, and no doubt for women to live through birth and a baby. Also, health care. Here's something that Nussbaum would give a positive right to people in the society, because she believes that life doesn't just need to be protected with a negative right, but there's a positive right to have your life. Number 2, dose, bodily health. So not only should people be capable of living, but they should be capable of living healthy lives. This means that they have a positive right to means goods of food, shelter, exercise, health care. Now, these things can be provided in various different ways, but at least everybody should have a threshold level of them. Third, bodily integrity. So you ought to be able to have the capability of controlling your own body. This is, again, a fairly typical liberal value, and one of the means goods here is freedom of movement, a negative right that other people should not, in fact, step in and try and control your body. Next, capacities for senses, imagination, and thought. These might seem a little bit abstract. This is certainly going beyond what the liberal tradition thought of, at least if we move beyond negative rights to these. We could certainly see where in the liberal tradition there have been a right to freedom of conscience and things like this. But Nussbaum, again, wants to go further in terms of positive rights. So the means goods that you might be entitled to here include some level of education, some level of exposure to art, and certainly a freedom of religion, maybe even a positive right to be able to learn about different religious traditions and philosophical traditions. Another central capability, the capability to experience emotions. Now here we could say that the means good involved is freedom and the ability to feel emotions. Now we might want to go beyond that in terms of positive rights, because you might have a right to experiencing particular forms of art or culture, but at the very least, freedom and the ability to feel. And here Nussbaum is concerned about abusive relationships or repressive relationships where people are told to hold everything inside and not be able to express their emotions. We can see here Nussbaum's emphasis on the importance of emotion in the moral and full human life, which breaks a little bit with that Platonic tradition, emphasizing reason, and that tradition that Aristotle picked up when he was picking on women. Another central human capability, practical reason, which is basically the capability to make your own plans and decide things that you want to do with your own life and carry those plans out over time. Well, here we need a negative right, a freedom to make your own decision. We also need a positive right, an experience of some kind of practical education that might teach you about how to set goals and how to pursue those goals. Another central human capability is the capability to participate in affiliations with other people. So here we see some of the social side of Nussbaum's Aristotelianism coming out, because she believes that social existence is a fundamental human good. Now, she's not going to force people to be participative in affiliations with others, but certainly they need to have the capacity to do so. So means goods that you might be entitled to here include freedom to develop particular relationships and to participate in institutions of identity. Here we ought to expand a little bit to say that institutions of identity are important in developing ideas of human dignity so that you can get together with people who are similar, who share particular traits or interests with you, and that you can develop your own identity in that social context. That you can be proud of yourself for being the particular things that you are and fitting into the particular societies that you fit into. So if you want to be a Trekkie, go for it. Get together with other Trekkies. Dress up like Star Trek characters. This seems like, I mean, not that. That's not specifically a capability that you should be able to and like entitled to, because we're not going to provide you with your Trekkie outfits. But that's the kind of thing that you could develop your identity around. Or if somebody wanted to get together a black student union, for instance, this seems like something that they should be entitled to do. Another central human capability is the capability to live amongst other species. Other positions have not adequately been able to take care of the status of other animals. Being frank here, a lot of animal activists are not going to be convinced that Nussbaum's system has been able to do that much better, because Nussbaum still is articulating things from an anthropocentric, that's a big word for like human-focused, human starting point, moral position. But being an Aristotelian actually gives her a little bit of a leg up here, because human beings ought not just to be able to live amongst other animals, but being an Aristotelian, you can recognize other animals as having properly forms of functioning, similar to the way that human beings have proper forms of functioning. So, for instance, having zoos might not be a sufficient means good in order to allow people to sufficiently live with other species. Because zoos actually kind of mess with animals' proper functioning. You can take the animals out of the jungle, but you can't always take the jungles out of the animals, something like that. In any case, in order to provide adequate means goods, it seems that we ought to provide some natural settings in which you can come across other species. So not only do we need to maintain the existence of other species of animal, but we need to maintain their existence and their proper functioning in natural contexts. Humans also ought to have the capability of participating in play. And in order to have this good, we'll need means goods, including leisure, time to be able to do something other than work. And this would require having like limits on hours during the week that you work. People would also need the means goods of space in order to play. And we might also go so far as to suggest that people would need tools of play. Although, given that you're only entitled to threshold levels, I don't think these tools are incredibly complicated. We wouldn't need to say that everybody's entitled to a playground, but they might be entitled to a stick and a hoop. Further, Nussbaum suggests human beings ought to be capable of controlling their own environment. Now, this will require means goods of political participation and private property. But note that, like the other means goods here, we're interested in threshold levels. So you're not entitled to all the private property that you can hold, or all the private property produced by your labor, or a share of all of the means of production, or anything like that. Nussbaum is neither a Lockean nor a communist. Okay, at this point we've laid out that list of things that Nussbaum conceives as central human capabilities, and we've listed some of the things, we haven't given a comprehensive list, of means goods that people would need to have access to in order to have those capabilities. But a lot of stuff is still not specified. So how much of those means goods would you need in order to establish a threshold level of those capacities to reach a dignified life? Nussbaum wants to leave some flexibility in her system and is open to some argument about these things. What she's most interested in doing is establishing this as an alternative framework to the ways that the liberal tradition has set forward on the one hand and the Aristotelian tradition originally represented. and certainly as an alternative to the libertarian view of the world, which in her account would not provide at all for basic levels of dignity for human life. Okay, all of this said, let's put Nussbaum in contact with the themes for our course. So, human nature. To be worthy of human dignity, human lives require threshold levels of central human capacities of life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. This account of human nature is meant to be a kind of middle place between the liberal rights account, which ended up somewhat lower in accounting for what people needed, and the Aristotelian account, which she believes went too far in specifying exactly what the full human life consisted of. Nussbaum's aiming at that middle position, which establishes the threshold for a dignified human life. Social or individual? Well, humans are naturally social, Aristotle, but they have rights to make choices about their own lives. So, liberty, both Aristotle and liberty come together. People and property. Well, people have rights to private property to the extent that this is necessary to provide them with their threshold central human capacities. But this is not an unlimited right to private property. This is just the right that you need in order to reach a particular threshold. Now, we would doubtless want to go beyond this in specifying exactly how our private property rights are going to work out, and Nussbaum's open to that. She just thinks that we ought to at least start with the account that we need this for threshold levels of human capabilities. Equality or inequality? Well, human beings are equal in dignity and should be provided with the means goods to enable threshold levels of human capacities. So she grounds the equality of humanity not in their powers, not in their rationality, not in their rights, but in their dignity. And this is the point to which she thinks that we ought to have thresholds of capacities to raise us to that level of dignity. What this requires will be partially person dependent, because humans begin with different powers and live in different societies. So the exact means goods that they will need in order to actualize their capacities will depend upon their conversion factor and how all of that works out. So we'll need to pay attention to the particular needs of particular people. The shape of government. Well, there's no doubt here that Nussbaum herself imagines liberal democracy so as to enable participation in government. Because participation in government is one of those means goods necessary to participate in the capacity for control over your own environment. The purpose of government on Nussbaum's account is to protect and provide, so protecting negative rights and providing for positive rights, those means goods that people are entitled to, which are the necessary means goods to get a threshold level of central human capacities. And what authorizes social leaders according to Nussbaum's account? Well, support from citizens participating in their own governance to provide threshold levels of human capacities. You're not a justifiable leader if you decide that you're not going to do this, because leaders owe their followers basic levels of human dignity. And this should really be what people are demanding in their participation in their own governance. All right, so we've gotten to the end of Nussbaum and her account of the capabilities approach to human justice. Now, as I've said, we've actually underdetermined the account of justice significantly here, because we need to work out exactly what threshold levels look like and how to maximize the different conversion factors for different people with different disabilities and different abilities from the very beginning. But we can get a general picture here of what the framework looks like and how that would work out for the future. definitely a more robust account than Nozick starts with, and in many ways a more robust account of justice than anything we've seen since classical thinking and the natural law tradition. We've also reached the end of another period in the class, which is that period where we discussed highly structured accounts of justice, and where that became kind of the central argument within the liberal tradition, really in part from Locke all the way down to Nussbaum. But in the process, we've seen the rise of something else, which was really with Rawls and then even more with Nussbaum, a tent to the particularity of persons. So Rawls starts out and says, well, if we're thinking in this ideally rational way, then we could go out and look at the particularity of persons and their strengths and weaknesses and advantages and disadvantages more adequately. And then with Nussbaum, we go all the way to saying, well, we need to focus on the particular capacities of different people, which will require entitlement to different things in order to get them to roughly equal capacities. But that emphasis on personal particularity and identity continues to become more and more important in contemporary arguments about politics, where it in fact becomes its own category as identity politics. As a matter of fact, there is no form of politics today that doesn't participate in some kind of identity politics. Politicians invariably draw upon arguments and use phrases and ideas to appeal to different racial groups, different gender groups, different minorities, and different majorities. Identity politics. Everybody does it, so we ought to take a look at it. And that's what we're going to do throughout the next readings and the next lecture, looking at some of the intersection of gender and race politics. And in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about these things too. So, if these things make you uncomfortable, get ready to be uncomfortable. We'll just keep going there. All right, I'll see you in my next lecture on racism and sexism.